Thank you all for coming today. The title of today's episode is Going Through Research One Step at a Time. And our guest this week is Dr. Blaine Fiss. To start us off with an introduction, we're going to have Jordan, my co host, introduce Blaine.
Yeah, thank you, Eden. So, Dr. Blaine Fiss obtained his BSc majoring in nanoscience from the University of Guelph in 2016. He then went on to obtain his PhD under the co-supervision of Professor Audrey Moores and Professor Tomislav Frizik, which focused on applying mechanochemical methods for sustainable phosphorus chemistry. Blaine then obtained a postdoctoral research associate position at the University of Western Ontario under the co-supervision of Professor Paul Ragonia and Professor Joanna Blackyer, working on the synthesis of key and small molecules as novel bidentate ligands. In 2023, Blaine became a member of the Canadian Society for Chemistry, working for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Committee, aka CSC wide. Blaine is currently a Killam Postdoctoral Fellow at Dalhousie University, working under the supervision of Professor Mita Dasoff on novel synthetic routes to plasmodic metal nitride nanoparticles and their applications toward clean energy solutions. He was recently featured in both Nature and Chemical and Engineering News, CNEN, regarding his journey as a chemist with cerebral palsy. In 2024, Blaine was named a top 100 candidate of the CAS Future Leaders Program and has published a broad range of reports on the application of mechanochemistry for more sustainable material syntheses. Welcome, Dr. Fiss.
What a truly impressive background. We're really, really happy to have you on, Blaine. So the general format that we're going to be using is we've got about 5 or 6 questions that we'll ask you, and then we'll open it up for some audience questions. Thank thank you for everyone for showing up. The first question that we wanted to ask you, since you've been so vocal and open about your cerebral palsy, I wanted to ask how has your experiences in academia been shaped by both your access needs and your identities?
Yeah, it's a really, I think, important question, both for myself in my own position, but also for other scientists that have to deal with disabilities of any variety, whether they're visible or invisible. So for context, I think it's important that I give the audience a sense of where I've come from and how that's, in essence, brought me to where I am now. So, as both Eden and Jordan had mentioned, I grew up with cerebral palsy, and I didn't actually take really any independent steps until probably about 7 or 8 years old. And even in that sense, it was heavily assisted, lots of assistive aids up until I was probably about 10 or 12. So these included a wheelchair, walkers, canes. So I really didn't have independent mobility up until I was probably about 15 or 16 years old. And part of that journey, apart from the physical challenge that that poses, I think that gave me a lot of insight into how to be resourceful moving through my world in a day-to-day basis. So if there's any takeaway from today's discussion, I think that resourcefulness coming as a result of my disability has really impacted my career in terms of how I approach lab spacing or equipment accessibility and how I approach developing presentations or conference material, also in how I approach solving problems. So how I look at actually doing science, I think is deeply rooted in that resourcefulness that I grew up in as a result of the challenges that I had faced.
Fantastic response. Thank you for sharing a bit of your journey with us. You mentioned a little bit in that response about how you took those experiences and used that as information and an ability to sort of look around your environment in a lab, understand, what sort of things might be accessible or less accessible. And I remember in our pre-interview conversation, we chatted a little bit about your feature in Nature and how visibility was kind of a double-edged sword there because there was a lot of positive reviews, but there was also some bad actors that had some negative aspects, negative opinions about being a scientist with cerebral palsy in a research lab. Did you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I can certainly. So the nature piece in particular was an interesting one, as you've sort of hinted at. because that was the first sort of scientifically associated or sort of scientifically tangential interaction that I had where people wanted to know more about my journey as a scientist and not just the science that I was doing. So, in that sense, when Nature reached out to me and wanted to do this piece and wanted to hear some of my experiences, that representation for me was really eye opening, and I wanted to do that justice. Because for me growing up, and I know we'll hint on this later in the discussion, but um, the representation really wasn't there. So when I was coming up through the system, I didn't have any benchmarks of what could a scientist with a disability look like, what sort of resources there were available to us. And so in that way, the Nature paper, I think, really gave a groundwork for me to discuss some of those things. But more importantly, and the other side to that was that at least online, we had a lot of pushback. So a lot of the community, both directly involved with science and those outside of it, would bring up points like, well, isn't this a safety issue if you have balance or coordination challenges? Does that make it more high risk as opposed to less high risk? And is that something that a lab manager or principal investigator can really afford to do? And for me personally, this type of discourse and these types of comments I had grown up with, not necessarily in a scientific context, but really that sense of being set apart or separated from society at large, or sort of how I felt moving day to day. And so while I think it's important that I use platforms like this to continue to share those experiences, to continue to use that voice in a way of improving the sciences in general, yeah, there's definitely going to be bad apples and negativity around those things. And I've learned to just sort of take that as they come and understand that um, regardless of how certain groups may feel, I'm still doing this for the right reasons. And it is a change that ultimately needs to happen, whether we think that directly in a regular basis, like somebody like myself, or if it's something more indirect that we only realize either later in our careers or later on in life. But yeah, balancing that positive and negative is definitely something that I've had to navigate throughout my career, and probably the sort of front facing or main hurdle that I typically run into.
Thank you for sharing that. The other thing that we wanted to chat a little bit about, you kind of mentioned representation. And in our pre-interview, you mentioned that the first time that you had actually seen a disabled chemist was only after you had gotten into graduate school, and it was a chemist while you're in your PhD that was a wheelchair user. Why why do you think that representation was so important for you in grad school? And how do you think not having that during your undergrad affected, maybe your self-perception or your perception of what chemistry was like going up into that?
Yeah, so I think like even when I was very young before I could walk, and my parents will often retell this story. But I wanted to be a scientist when I was about 5 or 6. So I knew for whatever reason that this was a path that I wanted to pursue fully. Again, at this point in my life, I would have been in a wheelchair, and so didn't really know of any scientists through my undergrad that had that type of challenge, that had faced the types of things that I had run into. Obviously, eventually in time, that became more apparent. But I think the challenge with not having that representation in undergrad, especially when you're going through very formative research years, so going through stages like all your practical labs and not necessarily seeing that representation presented. It does, you will oftentimes internalize that in a way of, do I belong? Is this really a space that I can make better or that I can improve upon? And I think at a more sort of practical level, there's a lot of pressure put on how we perform in our undergrad and early graduate years in terms of the papers we may publish, the grades we may get, the types of connections and resources that we develop in those years. And so by not really having a direct mentor that I could say, these are the physical challenges that I face, but also more than that, these are some of the emotional and psychological challenges that I'm running up against, and how do I properly navigate those things? not having someone that has that direct lived experience. I'm not saying that a mentor who isn't disabled can't provide those resources, but there is a nuance and I think a uniqueness to having scientists with disabilities in those roles. And so when I did eventually meet this professor at McGill who was wheelchair bound, that put a perspective shift, even subconsciously in my brain, of thinking, okay, this is now a position that I can actively see myself in. That more than just the visual representation of it, I could understand, okay, this is something where somebody else has gone through the system. They've been able to navigate very clear physical challenges, but more so than that, they've been able to develop a lab group which has functioned and worked around their challenges as well, whether that's the layout of the lab or how they manage certain resources that other able-bodied chemists may not actively run into. And so I think having that framework to say, okay, there is an example. And eventually in time, I've learned of more chemists in similar positions. But I think by having that example, it definitely spurred me on to say, okay, this is something we should pursue. And that the ground has essentially been broken for this to happen. And I think, and I'll just add this on as kind of an additional point. I'm speaking a lot about visible disabilities, and obviously have lived a very particular sort of set of challenges and path. But disabilities, as we define them, can be both visible and invisible as well. And so I've had to deal with my fair share of both in that sense. But I think by being more visible in terms of the challenges that I face, it becomes a little bit more obvious in terms of what some of those barriers may be and how we need to address them. I recognize that that's not always true for everyone, but I think that having that clear representation for me in grad school definitely made it obvious to me that, people had succeeded in doing this, and this is definitely something I can achieve.
And again, that kinda just boils back down to the double-edged sword of visibility, you know? On one hand, you get this wonderful ability to be a representative of, people with experiences like you, but, you do also get that negative side of people not necessarily being the best actors. So I think now, for some more, uplifting questions perhaps, Jordan is gonna be taking over for a couple of questions, and then I think we're gonna be passing it on to the audience. So Jordan, would you like to take it away now?
Yeah, so to build off of what Blaine was saying, first, sure, having someone to kind of look up to or examples of people that you see yourself in, very important. And as we've kind of increased diversity, not that there's an exact metric for that, I believe that has been a positive mode forward. Now, you talk about um, more tangible things like addressing more visible disabilities, while there may be less visible disabilities. So, um, how do you recommend we make tangible changes within our larger systems, i.e., like conferences, committees, institutes as a whole, and or within smaller systems like lab groups and departments and such?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think for me, and this boils down to how I was raised and sort of the environment that I grew up in, but all of this has to start with a conversation. We have to be open to talking about these things. And I think the second we begin to put stigma behind them or potentially villainize wanting to learn more about how we can help or what those barriers may be, I think that sense of sort of siloing people is really what hinders actually making tangible effort. Now, that's a very hand wavy sort of way of explaining it, but I have an example of this when I was in grad school, and I talk about it in the Nature paper as well. But when I was working at McGill, a lot of the NMR spectrometers that we had were accessible only by a step stool. And so for me, as someone with balance and coordination issues, having to step up onto a step stool, put a sample in, and then step back down poses a lot of balance issues that I didn't feel comfortable doing. And so in that moment, I decided, okay, I'm just going to have an open conversation with our facilities manager and be very honest and say, look, I'm not comfortable doing this myself. Would you be willing to load samples? Would you be willing to have, somebody come in on my behalf and load samples? And to their credit, our systems manager at McGill right away said, "I'll do you one better. We'll talk to facilities and get a full wooden staircase built." And so within a week, all of those step ladders had been replaced by now a physical wraparound staircase that essentially served the same purpose. And the benefit, and something I want to highlight for the audience, which I think is really critical, is by starting with that conversation, we had inherently fixed a barrier that I was facing, but we actually ended up benefiting the whole of that university. And I had friends from McGill years later come to me and say, we really felt a lot safer and a lot more stable using these stairwells. And we had no idea that that was a result of the conversation you had. So I think when we think about tangible things that need to happen, a lot of it is conversation based. Much of it absolutely is equipment and structure based for sure. And that's a more complicated conversation because a lot of that revolves around funding and where funding comes from and how do we find viable alternatives that may or may not exist. But I think, again, the basis for me in all of this is just having those open conversations first and foremost to say, we're not out here to judge people. We're just actively saying where are the gaps that we need to work on, just like we would for any sort of scientific problem. I think a lot of the behavior and the practices that we use in the lab can be reflected in solving similar problems. It's just in this case, it now has to do more with infrastructure and accessibility as well.
Yeah, that's great. I love that they were able to do that, and I hope more departments and universities are more open to that conversation and are looking to consider those things. Um, the whole and the individuals of those in their departments. So, we kind of touched on the double-edged sword aspect of, people, the general community's opinions on accessibility and what have you, and your kind of experience coming up through the system. So, in your time, what support systems have you leaned on during the difficult point in your career, if there were at all? How did they help you, and how could they have been better?
I'll say I've been very fortunate, I think at all stages of my career to really have a good support network in my corner throughout my time, whether that was as a grad student, even as an undergrad early on, doing my honors work, and now continuing on through a pair of postdocs at two different institutions. So I think a couple of key players in particular have been, my supervisors in grad school, Audrey Moores and Thomas Frischik. They really, I think, paved the way for me in having not only a representation of what a supervisor could do in these types of positions, but then actively wanting to follow up with it in tangible ways, whether that was in how they developed subsequent centers or in how we laid out the lab or access to equipment. I think in a lot of ways, principal investigators have a lot more control than they may realize to make those tangible changes. So in a lot of ways, the PIs have had a major impact. Another major player more recently, and Jordan, you touched on this in the introduction, but is my involvement with WIDE. So being a part of CSC WIDE has really opened my eyes and opened a lot of opportunities to a community at large that values science not only for the things we put on paper, but for the people behind it and how we can essentially work towards improving accessibility for all manner of people in sciences. So I think those um, pairings of a really good upbringing of principal investigators when I started graduate school, and subsequently now CSC wide on a broader scale from a community perspective, have really helped to support me through my career thus far.
No, that's great. Um, it makes me, it's more of an open question actually on that respect. Maybe you would like to answer, but do you find that perhaps that there's younger PIs are more observant of those things than those, or certain faculty that are more involved and self-aware than others?
I think so, and this is kind of the irony of the situation for me, at least coming from a physical disability standpoint. So the story or the anecdote that I will often tell people when they're thinking about why this is important is every single one of us in this room is going to face some physical disability at some point. Strictly just by aging and getting older, our bodies are going to say, I'm done doing the things that I used to do. And so I think generally, yes, the younger generation of faculty that are coming through now have a better not only understanding of the reality of what those barriers are, but they also have a better willingness to help. And I think that's where some of the irony, at least for me, lies, because a lot of the more established faculty, even though they themselves or people in their position may need or require those assistive aids. And again, I'm not only talking about in lab, I'm talking about writing grants, I'm talking about access to resources. Like there's a whole list of things we could get into. But in general, Jordan, I feel that yes, the younger generation of faculty coming through are much more involved. And I think it part and parcel is because of pieces like the Nature article and the fact that
Mhm.
journals by and large are putting more visibility behind these challenges that might not have been the case when more established faculty coming up through the system had gone through that process. So I think it is a byproduct both of age, but also just of how the community at large is giving more of a voice to those in that type of situation.
Yes. Thank you. Um, so before we open the floor, we have one final question for you, Dr. Fiss, that we always ask our guests. What is your favorite element or molecule and why? As since we're all chemists.
Yeah, and this I couldn't necessarily pinpoint when it happened exactly, but my favorite element absolutely is phosphorus. And I think for me, the major reasoning behind that, both for the versatility in which phosphorus can behave. So we're seeing new research now demonstrating that it can do redox switching similar to transition metals. So we're seeing a lot of catalytically relevant examples in that regard. But phosphorus is also a cornerstone element for humanity at large. So it's used in our bodies to form and store energy. And it's also used in all the fertilizers that we use to feed the planet. So it really, for me, I think is such a unique and yet really paramountly important element for humanity at large. And I've loved researching it throughout my career. It's been a great adventure for sure. So that would be my favorite if I had to boil it down to one.
That's fair. It's fairly needed and very versatile. Okay, and so with that, we'd like to open the floor to anyone in the audience that would like to ask Dr. Fiss any questions.
Hello, Blaine. Long time no see. Yes, I have a question for you. I know you have plans of pursuing academia, obviously, as you're in your postdoc and you're very successful in what you've done and with scholarships and so forth. Um, Once you establish your position as a PI in your own group, is there any plans of implementing any of these resources or anything that's accessible to the group that's a bit more um, doesn't have such a high barrier of kind of saying, "Hey, I have such and such," without being obvious to the group that they want to keep it more to themselves in terms of like implementing and fixing and advocating for their position.
For sure. Yeah, it's a really great question, Justin, and really nice to see you again as well. Yeah, I've learned through wide indirectly, but also I have plans for once my own group gets off the ground. I want to consolidate a lot of these resources, be it in a tab on our website or through a formal contract and resource list on our team website as well. So this is something I've actually seen implemented by other professors in Canada, where they will outright, when new folks join, they will have everyone sign essentially a lab contract, and it's more to do with how they conduct themselves as teammates and lab members, not so much contractually around like what they're expected to do or sort of the classical way we think of a written contract. And so I think apart from having those resources, I also want to give my students and researchers a way to um, openly and anonymously tell me when I'm doing things that aren't right, or tell me when other lab members maybe are stepping over that line. And I think by having that anonymous way of keeping people accountable, again, we're not out here to make people's lives miserable. It's not a witch hunt, but I think it's important that if people are dealing with these types of challenges and internalizing a lot of that, that will have a major impact on their career, whether they like to think it or not. And so I want there to be a venue in which people can actively get that off their chest so we can address problems at face value. and be able to really effectively make those changes in everybody. So yes, those are some of the ways that I hope to make my lab space more accessible once we get there. Yeah.
That's great. I know getting resources in that area isn't always the most easy in terms of accessibility. So having stuff that's consolidated is a great idea. Thank you.
I think Jyoti next.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that. I think, we've been doing a study. We're really looking at some of the initiatives that we have in terms of supporting EDI. And, one of the major things that come up that we're still lacking the ability to accommodate people with physical disabilities. So, so hearing, how you've been supported is really good to hear. So what would you suggest for people who are making some of these decisions and that they basically come down and say, well, it's the accessibility issue because of the lab space. And we know that it costs a lot to renovate. A lot of these buildings are old, but what are the tangible things that really help? So you said you had a very supportive PI team that's helped you as well address those. So what would be your suggestions to PIs wanting to take on students with this and help them in terms of accessibility without changing the building and things like that?
Of course. Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'll say first and foremost, PIs who are taking this on, they need to be celebrated, firstly.
Yeah.
But they also need to be recognized as well that this is a lot of additional work in some cases. And it is a partnership. It's a partnership between the researcher and the lead investigator to have those conversations of how do we make this the most successful degree or time with our group as we possibly can. And it's going to vary person to person. But in my experience, some of the more tangible things that we can do have been even working within teams or having teams that can almost work like small cohorts or even a buddy system. So if you really had, say, a synthesis or a setup that was just inherently inaccessible for one reason or another, um, you could make the argument, okay, I'm going to work with a senior researcher on this until that student is comfortable in their own right to do it. If it was something where beyond any sort of systems design, we couldn't actually make the science accessible, and that could just come down to the technicality of the science that we're doing. I would make the argument, and I know this is a bit of a stretch, but I would make the argument that it then falls on the PI to become creative in how they're approaching doing that chemistry. So even though we may think of doing chemistry the same way for hundreds of years, there are still and ongoing novel ways of doing chemistry that have become more accessible. Be that automated systems. Again, this isn't always accessible to everybody. But speaking from my own experience, applying mechanochemistry to a lot of these very reactive or potentially more hazardous chemistries has made them infinitely more accessible to people, both physically and in terms of the technical know-how that they need. So I think it really falls on PIs first and foremost to encourage those open conversations and say what's working, what's not working, and hold nothing back. Like really letting the researcher be brutally honest about where the hurdles are. But beyond that, I think it comes down to really reassessing in as best we can. Are there other ways that we can address access to this center, how we're using the equipment, how we're designing experiments? And that's a whole other level of involvement. But I think a lot of these challenges, at least at the scientific level, come down to creativity and how creative we're willing to be about them. So I don't know if that directly or indirectly answers your
No,
question, but that would be something I would approach it.
yes.
Yes.
No, I think that's a really good point that you've made there because I think the argument always stops with the, oh, we can't do anything with the space. The space is not accessible. But I really like that idea about, think about the experiment, think about how you can do it differently. And I think we need a little bit more voice to that, right? It's the same thing about, when we think about microaggressions, there's been a lot of training programs, and I think we need to hear laboratory or chemist hear that there are different things, and we shouldn't just close the door and say, it's the building. So I appreciate you saying that.
All right. I don't believe we have any more time left, tragically.
No.
Uh, but I did want to say thank you for coming on today, Dr. Mr. Fantastic Man, Blaine Fiss.
Great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really
Thank you for
appreciate
coming.
all of the things that you had to say.
And if the audience or other folks from C2MCI want to reach out to me by email with further questions or discussion points, please, they're welcome to do that. That's totally fine with me as well. So if folks have more questions, please reach out. I'm happy to help.